After an impressive week 2 win over the Vikings, the Falcons defense has checked every box so far. And does that mean that this defense is for real?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5. And if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use all across the FanDuel app. So if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. AKA. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your very first listen each and every day. And all you got to do is become an everydayer. Subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we are recapping the week 2 win over the Minnesota Vikings on this glorious victory Monday. This incredible victory Tuesday, as many of you are listening to this. We'll talk about, the possibility that the Falcons may be trading both Younghoe and Kirk Cousins in the very near future. How realistic is that? We'll talk a little bit more about this offense and maybe their over-reliance on throwing one pitch. But we got to start the conversation with, one of the stories of the game is the Falcons defense. Is it for real? And, I don't know if we know the answer yet, but through 2 games, it's looked for real, right? It's been very opportunistic, right? They've been absolutely exceeding expectations. Certainly my expectations. We went into the season, as you guys well know, being like, oh, maybe they get to league average level of defensive performance. And, that's kind of their ceiling. But, right now they're like performing at the level of a top 5, top 3 sort of defense. And, will they be able to maintain that? But when I talk about their opportunisticness, that was something that we did expect them to be, especially when it came to turnovers, capitalizing, being maybe a little bit more volatile. Getting some of the TFLs and whatnot and all that stuff. But you can go back to that Vikings game and see an example of them being opportunistic, where they are presented a challenge and they take advantage of that challenge, right? They take advantage of the opportunity given to them. And I outlined this on the Falcon Squad show on Monday on Locked On Sports Atlanta. But basically, you go to that one red zone drive that the Vikings had where they were able to get the ball down to the 2. They try to run a rollout. On the very next play, J.J. McCarthy sort of bobbles the snap, and that throws off the timing of the play where he misses Justin Jefferson in the back of the end zone. Then the very next play, the Vikings get a delay of game that pushes them back 5 yards. And now the Falcons, with the Vikings at the 7-yard line, that's when the pass rush gets home. That's when Jalen Walker beats Justin School to get his first sack of his NFL career. Then the following play, JJ tries to step up in the pocket, and Ruka Rora and I believe Zach Harrison were able to track him down with James Pierce also in the vicinity of that play to get that sort of sack. And that's what we mean when we're being opportunistic, taking advantage of the opportunities presented to you, where basically the Vikings kind of shot themselves in the foot with their sort of mistakes and errors on the 2 previous plays with the delayed game and the botched snap. And then the Falcons, chase them down, right? They're not necessarily bleeding out, but they're limping, and you chase them down and you bring them down. That's kind of what we mean. And, we've seen this pass rush come alive these first 2 weeks, in part due to, some injuries across the Bucs and Vikings offensive line, where arguably, their 2 best offensive linemen, Tristan Wirfs for the Bucs and Christian Darrisaw for the Vikings, were out of the lineup. We'll see some more injuries this upcoming week with Carolina, who they just put their starting center and starting right guard on injured reserve on Monday, coming off the heels of that. So, as I said, the Falcons defense is checking all the boxes when it comes to proving that they are a legit defense, whether it's stopping the run, whether it's pressuring the quarterback, whether it's creating all of those turnovers. But we'll have some more litmus tests to see just how for real is this. Is this the Falcons taking advantage of, some early slow starts for these offenses, some injuries and all that stuff? what will they look like not only against Carolina this upcoming week, but, I think Washington is going to be a good litmus test. Buffalo, San Francisco, the ensuing weeks, can they deal with a mobile quarterback like Jaden Daniels, right? What happens if AJ Terrell's out of the lineup and they don't have him to shut down Terry McLaurin like they did in that week 17 game? Obviously, Buffalo with Josh Allen and all the things that he brings to the table is going to be a challenge. We don't know if Brock Purdy's going to play in that 49ers game, but we know with Kyle Shanahan calling plays with the talented skill position players that the 49ers have, they can present some challenges. So, we sit here, looking at this Falcons defense in a positive light, maybe not nearly as positive as maybe other people are who are, sort of doing donuts in the parking lot. When it comes to how this defense is performed. The reason why we're not doing that here on this podcast is A, because I'm a hater, and B, because we try not to get too high after the wins here on the podcast. We try not to get too low after the losses, right? And part of it is also like the Falcons' history is like we have seen quality starts for this defense, not to the level that we've seen so far this year. But it's not new that, in the early part of the season when offenses usually take a month to kind of get up, to ramp up and get up to speed and rev up and all that stuff, that the Falcons defense plays reasonably good football for the first, 4 to 6 weeks of the season, right? You even saw that to a certain degree. You got to squint a little bit last year with the Jimmy Lake defense, but you especially saw that with the Ryan Nielsen defense, where basically the first third of that season, the first 6 or so games of that season, that defense was playing really lights out. And then things kind of fizzled out. And part of me wonders, are we going to get that? Not to mention, it's a week 2, and this isn't specific to the defense. This is more just the team. But you have a week 2 primetime game that the Falcons won. And they've had 4 of these over the last, 13 years where they've been a week 2 primetime game. They've won each of those games. And then in half of those cases, the team went into a slump immediately after that, or in other half of the cases, they were able to continue the good vibes for another chunk of the season before they, arguably went into a slump, at least in one of those instances. But, you go back to last year, they beat Philadelphia in that week 2 Monday night game, and they win 4 out of the next 6. And then obviously the season unravels in the back half of the season. 2019, again, against Philadelphia, immediately following that win where, Duke Riley and company were dancing in the locker room, that image will always live in my brain forever. They lost 6 straight games. That's one of the reasons why it lives in my head forever. Immediately following that game, 2017, they beat the Packers, I believe, on Monday night. They lost 4 out of their next 6, coming off of the heels of that one. And then 2012, where they picked off Peyton Manning a bunch against the Broncos, and then they won 5 straight as part of their 8-0 start to that 2012 season, and ultimately had a lot of success that year. So that's part of it, where it's just like, week 2 primetime games aren't always the greatest litmus test for what the rest of the season is going to be like for the Atlanta Falcons. And so ultimately, when we ask, is this Falcons defense for real, it's like, we'll see. But so far so good. And as I said, we're not going to quite do victory laps or donuts in the parking lot. But if I was you, if you want to celebrate, by all means. I should say, we, as in Locked On Falcons, is not going to do that. But if you want to do the donuts in the parking lot, do it, because you don't know how long this is going to last. Historically speaking, it probably won't last that much longer based off of the history of the Falcons in terms of playing an elite unit. So if, you're just like, hey, man, I haven't been able to do donuts in the parking lot, talking about the Falcons defense in a very, very long time, so I'm gonna do the donuts in the parking lot, then hey, do you donuts in the parking lot. Just buckle your seatbelt, guys. Be safe out there and whatnot. So we'll probably talk more about this defense, get more into the nitty gritty when we get into the all 22 review tomorrow on the podcast. We'll highlight some of the things that they did well, particularly in detail when we get into that all 22 breakdown. But let's talk about the offense, which is not quite living up to the standard, but we'll talk a little bit more about some of the reasons why that is, why they haven't been able to get the explosive vertical passing game going, their over reliance on sort of one pitch. So we'll get into more of that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So today's episode is brought to you by our proud sponsor, Mazda, who crafts cars for those who do more than simply move. We know that pro athletes, really sweat the small stuff, all the details whether it's footwork, breath work, or whatever. Athletes sweat all those details, and Mazda does the same. They bring that same intention to how they craft every vehicle. You can feel it with the Japanese craftsmanship in every detail, from the metallic accents to the available Nappa leather upholstery. And you can make everyday drives feel anything but like everyday drives because of Mazda's smooth handling and intuitive controls. With their all-wheel drive standard in every crossover SUV, you can drive with confidence through almost any season, whether it's the regular season, postseason, preseason, off-season, or draft season. Like our players, Mazda, we sweat every detail, because when you make every move count, impossible becomes irrelevant. Mazda, move and be moved. And today's episode is also brought to you by Monarch Money. When most people can't name all their financial accounts, they can't even name what they're worth. What is a 401k? What have I invested in, right? You don't have that full picture, and you wind up leaving money on the table. Man, Monarch Money can help you with that. They're the all-in-one personal finance tool that's going to bring your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface. Whether that's on your laptop or on your phone, they're going to do the heavy lifting for you, linking all your accounts in minutes so you can see those clear data visuals, get that smart categorization on your spending, and finally feel in control of your money without ever needing to touch a spreadsheet. And of course, they also can help you cancel subscriptions, right? You can spot a couple of subscriptions that you didn't realize that you were using and save money every single month. Don't let this financial opportunity slip through the cracks. Make sure you use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com, and you'll get half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code LOCKEDONNFL. So rewatching the film this morning of the offense, not a whole lot to glean outside of some of the observations we made in last night's rapid reaction. As we mentioned, the Falcons utilized a lot of 12 personnel, 2 tight end sets. It was very effective when it came to the run game. Probably tomorrow when we get to the all-22 review, we'll take a deeper dive into that run game, looking at the diversity, looking at the use of a fullback. Oh boy, guys, we're going back. Zac Robinson, again, he's not beating the allegations that he's in every day of this podcast, because we've been pounding the table since his arrival that, this offense needs a fullback, and they have the day that they have when they get Charlie Warner out there doing fullback stuff. And, it's not a coincidence, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. But, we can talk a little bit more, because we're going to talk more about the running game tomorrow. We can talk a little bit more about the passing attack today. And one of the questions we had, without having gone through the film, but we had some suspicions about why couldn't the Falcons, get the vertical passing game going, right? We've seen this sort of be not apparent in the offense at all. And that was one of the big expectations that we had with Michael Penix going into the season, that one of the selling points on why this offense was going to be better with Michael Penix at the helm than it was with Kirk Cousins or any of their predecessors, was because of his ability to, stretch defenses vertically with his big time passing attack or big time arm, attacking downfield. And we didn't get to see that really much at all in these first 2 games. We didn't see that against the Vikings. Again, we speculated a lot of it probably had to do with the way that the Vikings played, and going back and rewatching the film, it seemed to confirm that's what it was. A lot of sort of those 2 high safety shells, whether we're talking cover 2, cover 4, or whatnot, those types of shells that are designed to kind of limit the explosive play, force quarterbacks to throw short and underneath passes, as opposed to trying to push the ball down the field. And we talked about that all offseason as something that we would probably see teams try to do. Now, the Vikings just naturally do that. And we'll see what adjustments other teams can make this season when it comes to, will teams lean a little bit more into those looks, than they traditionally would when they face the Falcons, as a way to try to take away the deep ball. So, you couple that, taking away the deep ball, and then you couple that with the Vikings' propensity to blitz and bring pressure, and what pressure does is typically it's going to get the ball out of the quarterback's hands a lot quicker. Now, obviously, Michael Penix was able to handle that reasonably well, but, it led to less opportunities for the Falcons to attack down the field. And, some of that is owed to not necessarily having a well-oiled play action passing attack, which we've discussed on each of the last a couple of games. Well, we've been discussing here on Locked On Falcons for basically 9 months now at this point in time, and probably will continue discussing at least for another 9 weeks. But we'll see on that front. Again, like they didn't really try to dial up play action. Although, the one time that they did kind of succeed with their play action was early in the game on that play where Penix rolled out through this sidearm pass, hit Drake London on a potential explosive play, but then he was stripped by Eric Wilson on that particular play. And maybe we'd be having a very different conversation had that, gone for 20 plus yards like it could have on that particular play. And that would have allowed the Falcons to be like, oh, this play action is working. Let's keep running some of these things. So we'll see if the Falcons can get their play action attack on track and that vertical passing game on track. I think Carolina this week will be another golden opportunity. Carolina, unlike Minnesota, runs a lot of cover 3, which should allow them to attack this defense vertically. We saw them do that pretty effectively in that Week 18 game with Michael Penix. So it'll be interesting to sort of see that chess match and, what adjustments Carolina makes. But we'll be talking about that a week from today. So, this offense has generally done its best work against cover 3 defenses. So, we didn't get to quite see that in Week 1. Hopefully we'll see more of that in Week 3 against Carolina. So hopefully that will be kind of their get right game for the Atlanta Falcons. And, is an incredible world that we live in when the Atlanta Falcons are not the get right game for opposing. Well, I don't want to speak too soon, right? I don't want to jinx it, but so far the Falcons have not been the get right game for opposing teams. And maybe other teams will be our get right game. And so that would be a nice change of pace for the Falcons. But last little tidbit, before we move on is, it was interesting revisiting the whole notion of them using 12 personnel, which according to Next Gen Stats, I forget the exact stat I quoted last night, but it's like 87% of the Falcons snaps use 2 tight ends, which was the most of any team since 2016, since that's been charted by Next Gen Stats. And it's just an interesting sort of development because it's kind of a continued trend that we've seen with this Zac Robinson led offense, which is one of the reasons why I've been probably a little bit more critical of Zac Robinson up to date than others. And now everybody else is, finally catching up. I'm an innovator and icon, and everybody else is being very critical of Zac Robinson. And I'm like, oh man, if only you guys were, on the same level as I was, 9 months ago. But, one of the criticisms we've had for Zac Robinson is, the tendency that they kind of spam one concept. We saw this a lot in 2024, whether it was the run game with the outside zone, whether it was, them using 11 personnel or 3 wide receiver sets, to the highest rate in the NFL to, basically outside of 3 games, really not using 2 tight end sets or any other formation really at all. 11 personnel, like over 90% of their plays outside of 3 games. It's this tendency where like they find a thing that works and they just kind of spam it. And then like at a certain point, opposing teams adjust and it stops working. And then they're like, oh, well, I guess we'll try something else, and it's just, again, like it's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it is like in an ideal world. And again, that contributes to why it's like, yeah, Zac Robinson's fine, but like this is what prevents him from being one of the top play callers in the NFL. Going back to last year, and that seems to be continuing this year, is just like this notion of like you want to have more than one pitch, right? And like that's kind of the issue with the Falcons. Like they have one pitch, they throw one pitch. If it's effective, great. It's like a fastball. And on Sunday it was the 2 tight end sets and the run game and all that stuff. And then like, but you want to have more tools in your like the truly powerful offenses. Have multiple pitches in their arsenal. They can beat you with the fastball, with the curve, with the knuckle, all that stuff, slider, sinker, etc. Going back to my, mental Rolodex of baseball pitches that I haven't had to use in many, many years. I'm not a baseball guy. Go check out Locked On Braves. Jake will have you covered on that one. But I think, I would like to see that change. I would like to see that evolve. So we'll see if that evolves. But, to me, the best offenses are the teams that can beat you in multiple ways as opposed to beating you in one way. And so we'll see if the Falcons will develop into that offense this season. So far, we haven't really seen that through now 19 games of Zac Robinson calling plays. As you guys probably can guess, I tend to be skeptical. Like if we haven't seen it through 19 games, we're probably not going to see it over the next 15 games, but you never know. So that's where we are at, where we spend a lot of time criticizing Zac Robinson, rightly so, if you ask me. And so we'll just kind of wait and see, and we'll give it a couple more weeks, to see if we get to see things that we haven't seen so far. And if we don't, then it's just like, okay, well, this is just what he is, and then we'll see how that all plays out over the course of the season, and then we'll judge it. We'll have a referendum at the end of the season on is this worthwhile moving forward. But we'll deal with that in January as opposed to as we sit here in September. But a thing that we can potentially talk about in September as well as October all the way up to the beginning of November is the possibility of a trade, right? And the Falcons are going to hang on to Younghoe for at least another week, it seems like. And is the reason behind that because they think they can work out a trade? And there's a lot of quarterbacks that have gone down in the last 24 to 48 hours across the NFL. And does that mean that we're one step closer to a Kirk Cousins trade? We'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So today's episode is also brought to you by FanDuel. With the NFL season among us, FanDuel's here to make sure that you're ready for kickoff with this can't miss offer, because right now new customers can bet just $5. And if your bet wins, you get $300 in bonus bets to use all across the FanDuel app. That's $300, okay, in bonus bets, guys. $300, okay, bonus bets, right? That's what you need, and the ways that you can use it on FanDuel. We love a same game parlay where you can just look at a game like the Falcons' upcoming game, and you're like, hey, I think Bijan's going to have another big game, or, oh no, I think this is going to be a Tyler Algier game, and you can bet the over-under on rushing yards. You can bet who's going to score the first touchdown. You can bet, over-under Bryce Young passing yards and whatnot. So you can hit that on the same game parlay, or, if you're just feeling really strongly about one player in specific, whether it's a Falcon player, a Panther player, you can just bet a simple player prop, or of course, you can just bet straight up against the spread or money line who's going to win without worrying about who's going to win by a certain number of points. Those are all available for you at FanDuel, when it comes to betting your first $5 bet. So go check it out at FanDuel.com, download the FanDuel app, and you can get started. And again, if your first $5 bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets only at FanDuel to place your first $5 bet. So let's talk about Younghoe. Raheem Morris said on Monday after the team returned to Atlanta that there's a 90% chance that Parker Romo is going to be the Falcons kicker this week against Carolina. And, I know a lot of people are like, what? What do you do? But people like to freak out about stuff. But it does sound like the Falcons aren't planning on cutting Koo this week, which we speculated on after last night's game, where Romo is going to be the kicker for the foreseeable future. And that's fine. There's no rush to cut Koo. The Falcons can so play this. And I think, opens the door potentially for a trade. Again, do I think a trade is likely to happen? No, for the same reasons. Well, maybe not the same reasons, but for similar reasons that a Kirk Cousins trade is unlikely to happen. But we'll circle back to that in a second. But I know my good buddy David Harrison, who's the host of Locked On Commanders, was speculating over the weekend that Washington's in the market for a kicker after Matt Gay missed 2 field goals against Green Bay on Thursday Night Football. Now, Gay missed 2 50-plus yard kicks in Lambeau. And I don't know if Koo is the type of guy that you want to solve that specific problem where it's like, oh, kicking long field goals outdoors. Historically, that's not been a strength of Younghoe, but, don't tell David Harrison, and certainly don't tell Adam Butler. Who the heck is the Adam Jenkins? I don't know. His name is Adam. the Commanders GM. I forget what his last name is. It's like a normal name, but Commanders GM. Now you guys can tell when I don't do research for the show. I'm like, I don't even know that guy's name. Anyway, when you try to pretend like you know something that you don't know, which is not the normal here on Locked On Falcons. But And we'll see if the Falcons get, a conditional late round pick for Koo in 2028 or something like that at this point in time. And again, I think the possibility, the 4% chance that happens, makes it kind of worthwhile to hold on to Koo for at least another week or two to see if something can develop. The Falcons are relatively healthy. They're not desperate to open up a roster spot. Carrying 2 kickers for another week is like not going, oh, well, this team is going to be ruined. Like, there's no possible way that they can field together a healthy team against, like it's people being dramatic for, dramatic sakes. And it's kind of a similar conversation that we've been having for 8 months about Kirk Cousins, where it's like, hey, just be patient. And eventually someone's going to calling for Kirk Cousins. And that was the thing that people kept insisting to me every time we talked about the possibility of Kirk Cousins trade. But maybe it's time that trade finally pays off, right? That patience is a virtue, and that virtue finally pays off now. With a lot of the injuries going around the league among starting quarterbacks, we saw I think 5 quarterbacks go down over the weekend. Minnesota, JJ McCarthy with a high ankle sprain, Washington with Jaden Daniels spraining his knee. Cincinnati, Joe Burrow with a severe turf toe injury. San Francisco, Brock Purdy with a turf toe injury. Justin Fields got a concussion with the Jets. For several of those guys, we don't know quite how long they're going to miss. We know Purdy and McCarthy is going to be a few weeks. We know Joe Burrow is going to be a few months, right? The reports are 3 months with a severe turf toe injury for Joe Burrow and the Cincinnati Bengals. But, again, that makes this, of these 5 teams, that's the most realistic of the trade. Because, again, no one's going to trade for Kirk Cousins, if their starting quarterback's just going to miss a couple of games, right? By the time Kirk gets up to speed in the offense, which is probably going to take the better part of a month for several of these offenses, like the starter's going to be back. And it's like, okay, what was the point of that? But, when it comes to Cincinnati, it's like, at least it's plausible because, 3 months at this point in time would basically mean Joe Burrow would, whatever the timeline is, week 14 or something like that, week 15, somewhere around there. So, he might come back by the end of the season, but, that's a long-term option. And that's the most likely team to come calling for Kirk Cousins. But here's the problem. I see a punch bowl and I'm like, you know what? I got to go to the bathroom, if you're following what I'm saying. Because I just don't think it's realistic to think a Bengals trade is going to happen, right? You just got to, obviously from the Falcons perspective, yes, please, Cincinnati, please come take Kirk Cousins off our hands. But from the Bengals perspective, it still doesn't make a ton of sense, right? They have Jake Browning, their backup quarterback behind Joe Burrow, right? He proved to be 2 years ago very serviceable as a starter when Joe Burrow missed half of that season. The Bengals went 4-3 with Browning as their starter during that stretch. He had a comeback win against Jacksonville last week when Burrow exited about midway through that game as well. So, in theory, if you say, okay, well, he's won 5 out of the 8 games that he's played significant snaps in over the last 3 years, in theory, if Joe Burrow is going to miss 15 games, which is the rest of the season, in theory, the Bengals should be able to go 9-6 with Jake Browning, which will put them in playoff contention. So, there's no reason for the Bengals at this point in time, based off of what they know about Jake Browning, based off of his history, to feel like, oh, our season's done with Joe Burrow being out for 3 months or something like that. So that's one reason why, they won't be desperate to trade for Kirk. But the bigger reason, again, goes back to what we've been saying all along, which is the contract, right? No one wants to take on that Kirk Cousins contract. You'd be trading for Kirk to be a very expensive backup quarterback in Cincinnati. You'd have to negotiate with the Falcons how much of the $37.5 million that is left on Kirk Cousins' contract, 27 of that, 27.5 of that is due in 2025, and an additional 10 million is due in 2026. And you would have to negotiate with the Falcons. How much are you willing to take on? We've seen the previous reports that have been refuted by Terry Fontenot about, the Falcons want teams to take on at least $20 million. All that stuff, won't get into that. But let's just say, hypothetically, $37.5 million, the Bengals and Falcons say we'll split it evenly, right? That's about over $18 million, almost $19 million that the Bengals would be taking on in terms of cap space, which would basically make Kirk, even at that price tag, more expensive than Trevor Lawrence in terms of his cap hit this year, and would make him the 17th highest paid quarterback in the NFL. He's already, somewhere in the top 5 or 10 based off his cap hit at this point in time. Not to mention the Bengals only have $13 million currently in cap space. Now, obviously, they can find ways to free up more. But if you're the Bengals, like, we just need a body to hold down the fort as a backup for 3 months. Taylor Heineke, Desmond Ritter, who was with the team in training camp, Tim Boyle. You can get those guys for pennies on the dollar. We believe in Jake Browning. We just need to get a cheap backup, quarterback that has some starting experience to hold down the fort for 3 months until hopefully Joe Burrow comes back. Why would we go out there and spend $18 million plus on Kirk Cousins when we can spend 1/10 of that on or probably less than the 10th of that on one of these other guys? And so that's why, like, I sit here and I go, like, yeah, the Kirk trade's not going to, at least not to Cincinnati. Now, maybe another injury. We still got till week 9 the trade deadline, so we still got 7 more weeks where something could develop. But I don't think the Joe Burrow injury means that the Falcons are going to get some phone calls from the Bengals. Right? Well, maybe they get a phone call, but I don't think it's going to be a serious phone call. They're just going to be like, hey, what's going on with Kirk? These GMs they like to talk to each other. They're sitting there bored in their office, twirling pencils with their feet up on the desk, and they're just like, you know what? I'm going to give Terry Fontenot a call. I'm going to give Duke Tobin is the Bengals de facto GM, I think. I'm going to give him a call because I'm bored at work. That's basically what GMs do. That's why they are constantly talking to one another, if you ask me. You're just sitting in the room bored, just like, oh, all right, I guess I'll watch some college film or call another GM. But anyway, working on my fan fiction about being an NFL GM during downtime and the hot, steamy romance that you have. No, I'm kidding. I know you guys are like, what is Aaron talking about? Yeah, it's a ridiculous day. When the Falcons are doing well, like, we can get into ridiculous topics as opposed to like, well, they got to fix this stuff. So we'll see. Not to mention the no trade clause with Kirk. Does he want to uproot his family for 3 months, theoretically, in the Cincinnati situation, and then potentially have to uproot his family again after the season, because he has no long-term future in Cincinnati. And again, I don't know the answer to that question. Kirk is the only person that can answer that question, but that's also a factor in why I would be skeptical of a Kirk trade happen. So we'll keep an eye over the next 7 weeks to see if other more likely opportunities develop for a Kirk trade. We'll see, what happens with Younghoe. I wouldn't panic about, the Falcons not cutting Koo immediately. And I know some people just like to complain about, I'm the first person to complain about, back in roster spot, just see what I had to say about the Falcons keeping Kyle Hinton last year over Matt Hennessy, which would have averted a lot of issues at the center position. But, it is what it is. I don't think carrying 2 kickers for a couple more weeks is some huge, massive, complete disaster, as maybe some people will tell you that. But we'll see what happens with that. Tomorrow we'll be back with an all 22 review, looking at this defense, looking at this run game, as well as potentially other things that emerge on the film. And then, of course, we'll get you guys geared up for the upcoming Panthers matchup later this week. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. In order to check all of that stuff out, all you got to do is check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And, of course, for your second listen, if you want to get caught up with all the news going on around the rest of the NFL, make sure you check out Locked On NFL. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.